It's gonna be okay. Take your time, dear. We're here for you.
I'm so sorry, hon. Take a deep breath. You're safe now.
The old woman had been sitting there long enough for the city to forget her. The bench was placed slightly away from the main sidewalk, close enough to the road to hear the traffic, far enough to be ignored by those in a hurry. She sat upright, not slouched, not restless, as if posture itself was a habit she had refused to let go of. Her coat was old but clean, carefully buttoned, the fabric softened by years of wear. A small handbag rested beside her, untouched. She wasn't waiting for a bus, or checking the time, or scanning faces for someone familiar. She was simply there, watching the day move forward without her participation. People passed by in fragments, shoes, shadows, conversations that faded before they reached her. Some glanced briefly and looked away, others didn't look at all. The city had learned how to move around her without slowing down. She had learned how to sit without asking. A patrol car rolled through the street at an unremarkable speed, just another part of the city's rhythm. Inside, the officer followed routine with practiced ease, eyes moving automatically from mirrors to intersections to sidewalks. Nothing about the day suggested it would matter. Then something interrupted that rhythm, not a call, not a signal, not a problem. It was the stillness. The officer's gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary on the bench, on the old woman who hadn't shifted position, who didn't seem tired, bored, or lost. She looked deliberate. As if sitting there was not a consequence, but a choice. The car moved forward another few meters before the thought fully formed. He slowed down, uncertain why. The decision to stop wasn't immediate. It was resisted. There were no rules that required it, no reason that would justify the time on a report. Still, something felt unfinished. The officer pulled over, the engine idling softly, and stepped out. The sound of his door closing caught her attention. The old woman lifted her head slowly, not startled, not defensive. Her eyes met his with a calm that carried no expectation. She had seen uniforms before, many of them, over many years. Some had walked past. Some had paused and moved on. She did not speak first. The officer approached carefully, aware that age carried both vulnerability and authority of its own. He asked if she was all right, his voice measured, respectful. She nodded once, as if acknowledging the question rather than answering it. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, shaped by years of choosing words carefully. She did not explain why she was there. Instead, she commented on how the street used to be quieter in the afternoons, how there were fewer cars once, more people walking, more conversations that lasted longer than a few steps. It wasn't small talk. It was orientation. She was placing him in a context he hadn't realized he lacked. The officer listened, initially out of courtesy, then with growing attention. He noticed details he hadn't before, the way she held eye contact without demanding it, the absence of complaint in her tone, the precision with which she described things that no longer existed. She spoke of time not as something lost, but as something that had passed through and left marks behind. As she talked, it became clear that she was not waiting for assistance. She was waiting for recognition. Not of herself alone, but of something she carried quietly. The officer sat down beside her, not because the situation required it, but because standing suddenly felt inappropriate. The bench creaked softly under the added weight. Around them, the city continued, unaware that its routine had been interrupted in the smallest possible way. What neither of them said yet was that this meeting was not accidental. That the reason she sat there every day, and the reason he had finally stopped, were slowly aligning into something neither could walk away from once it was spoken aloud. The officer didn't realize how much time had passed until the sound of a distant siren reminded him that the world hadn't paused with them. He glanced briefly at his watch, then back at the old woman, and felt an unfamiliar hesitation. Leaving suddenly felt wrong, as if doing so would cut off something that had only just begun to surface. She noticed the movement and spoke again, this time more deliberately, as though she understood that moments like this rarely lasted unless someone chose to hold them open. She asked him how long he had been on the force. The question was simple, but the way she asked it carried weight, as if the answer mattered beyond curiosity. When he told her, she nodded slowly, calculating years in her head, aligning them with memories only she could see. She remarked that uniforms changed faster than the people inside them, that badges were redesigned, policies rewritten, but intentions had a way of revealing themselves early. The officer felt the conversation shifting, moving away from observation and toward something more personal, more precise. She began to talk about watching officers walk these streets decades earlier, how some carried themselves with urgency and others with restraint. She described one in particular, not by name, but by habit, the way he adjusted his hat before speaking, the way he stood slightly between danger and those who couldn't move fast enough. The officer listened, unsure why these details unsettled him. There was a familiarity in them, not because he recognized the person she described, but because he recognized the standard. It was the kind of example instructors talked about briefly before moving on to procedures and protocols. The old woman paused often, not because she struggled to remember, but because she measured how much to say. She was not telling a story for entertainment. She was revealing something gradually, testing whether the listener was willing to stay with it. When the officer asked why she came to this bench every day, she did not answer immediately. She looked ahead instead, watching people pass, noting which faces slowed and which never turned. Finally, she said that places remembered even when people didn't. That this bench had once been a meeting point, a pause between decisions, a place where someone had chosen to do the right thing when it was easier not to. The officer felt the implications settle uneasily. He asked who that someone was. The old woman turned to him then, really looked at him, as if weighing something. She said that names were less important than consequences. That Max echoed quietly for years, shaping lives without ever appearing in official records. She explained that what happened here was never written down, never acknowledged, but it had cost someone everything. The officer felt his role shifting. He was no longer a passerby who had stopped out of courtesy. He was being positioned deliberately, placed into a narrative that had waited a long time for the right listener. He wondered if this was coincidence or design, if stopping had been his choice or simply the next step in something already in motion. The old woman's voice softened, not with sadness, but with resolve. She said she wasn't there for justice or apology. She was there to see whether the values she once believed in still existed in the present. Whether the uniform still meant what it once had to someone willing to listen. As the weight of her words settled, the officer understood why no one expected him to stop. Because stopping meant inheriting a story that demanded more than attention. It demanded response. The officer shifted slightly on the bench, not out of discomfort, but because something in the air between them had changed. The old woman had stopped speaking, yet the silence felt heavier than her words. He sensed that whatever came next was not meant to be said casually. She reached into her handbag slowly, her movements deliberate, as if time itself had learned to wait for her. From inside, she took out a folded photograph, its edges worn smooth, the surface creased from being opened and closed too many times to count. She did not hand it to him immediately. Instead, she held it between her fingers, looking at it once more before offering it, as though confirming that this was the moment it was meant to leave her hands. When the officer finally looked at the photograph, he understood why she had been careful. It showed a much younger man in uniform, standing on this very street, the buildings behind him unmistakable even after decades of change. The badge was different, the hat outdated, but the posture was unmistakable. The man stood not with authority, but with purpose. Beside him, just at the edge of the frame, was a younger version of the old woman, her face sharper than, her eyes carrying the same quiet intensity. The officer felt a tightening in his chest. He did not recognize the man personally, but he recognized the stance. It was the stance of someone who had chosen responsibility over convenience. The old woman began to speak again, her voice steady, untouched by sentimentality. She explained that the man in the photograph had been her husband. He had been an officer who believed deeply in the idea that the badge was not protection for power, but a shield for the vulnerable. One night, many years ago, something had happened on the street. There had been fear, confusion, pressure to act quickly and decisively. Orders had been given that night, orders that were lawful on paper but wrong in spirit. Her husband had refused to carry them out. Instead, he had stepped in front of someone who could not defend themselves, knowing exactly what that choice would cost him. He was suspended first, then quietly dismissed. No ceremony. No explanation that could be spoken aloud. The official record reduced his career to a footnote. The city moved on. The officer listened, his training suddenly feeling inadequate. He had learned about ethics in classrooms, about judgment in controlled scenarios, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of a truth that existed outside policy manuals. He asked what happened afterward. The old woman's gaze drifted back to the street. She spoke of years that followed, of doors closing quietly, of reputations fading, of a life reshaped by a single decision that never made headlines. Her husband never regretted it, she said. What hurt was not the loss of the job, but the silence. The way the institution he served erased him rather than confront what he had revealed. The officer realized then why she had chosen him, or perhaps why the moment had chosen them both. She was not asking him to fix the past. She knew that was impossible. What she was doing was more subtle and far more demanding. She was asking whether the present would acknowledge what the past had buried. Whether the uniform he wore still had room for the kind of integrity that once cost a man everything. As the officer handed the photograph back, he felt the full weight of the choice now resting with him. He could stand up, thank her for sharing, and return to duty unchanged. Or he could accept that stopping had placed him inside a story that was no longer hers alone. And as the city continued to move around them, unaware of the history unfolding quietly on that bench, the officer understood that whatever he chose next would determine whether this story ended as memory or as continuity. The officer sat back slightly, the photograph no longer in his hands but its weight still present. Training told him to compartmentalize, to separate personal emotion from professional responsibility, yet nothing about this moment fit into a category he had been taught. The old woman watched him closely, not impatiently, but with the calm of someone who understood that decisions worth making were rarely quick. She told him she had spoken to other officers before over the years, some younger, some older, some who listened politely and moved on. None of them had stopped long enough to feel implicated. She had learned not to resent that. Most people, she said, were not cruel, they were simply careful about where they allowed themselves to stand. The officer felt that observation land uncomfortably close to home. He realized that the uniform he wore had given him distance as much as it had given him authority. It allowed him to observe without becoming involved, to acknowledge without committing. Sitting there, that distance was gone. He asked her what she wanted from him now, expecting perhaps a request for recognition, for a name to be restored, for a record to be corrected. She shook her head slowly. What she wanted was not something he could file or submit. She wanted to know whether, if placed in the same position today, someone wearing that badge would make the same choice her husband had. Whether integrity still had a place when it came at a cost. The question unsettled him because it offered no safe answer. To say yes was to accept the possibility of sacrifice. To say no was to admit that something essential had been lost. He understood then that this was not a test meant to be passed with words. It was a mirror held up to his own understanding of duty. The officer thought about the pressures he faced daily, the unspoken expectations, the subtle incentives to avoid complications. He thought about how easily good intentions could be diluted by routine, how often doing nothing was rewarded as professionalism. The old woman spoke again, not accusing, not persuading. She said her husband never asked to be remembered as a hero. He only hoped that one day, someone would recognize that he had not failed his duty, but fulfilled it in a way that records could not capture. The officer felt the weight of that responsibility settle into something quieter and more durable than guilt. It was resolve, not yet defined, but undeniable. As the light shifted and the shadows lengthened, the officer stood up, not abruptly, but with intention. He did not offer reassurance or make promises he could not guarantee. Instead, he told her that he could not change what had happened, but he could refuse to let it remain invisible. He did not know yet what form that would take, only that walking away unchanged was no longer an option. The old woman listened without reacting, as if she had expected nothing less and nothing more. When he turned to leave, the bench no longer felt like a place of waiting alone, but a threshold. Whatever came next would require action, not spectacle, and the officer understood that the hardest part of honoring history was allowing it to shape the present without compromise. The officer did not leave immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment longer, looking at the street through eyes that no longer saw it as neutral ground. Every sound felt sharper now, every movement layered with meaning. The old woman remained seated, her posture unchanged, as though the outcome of this meeting did not depend on what followed next. She had not come for certainty. She had come for recognition, and that had already happened. The officer finally spoke again, quietly, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone acknowledging inheritance. He told her that institutions often forgot the people who shaped them, but individuals did not have to. That he could not restore a career or rewrite an ending, but he could choose what story continued forward. The words were not dramatic, but they carried intention. The kind that could not be undone once spoken. In the days that followed, the officer returned to duty, but not to routine. He requested access to old records, asked questions that had not been asked in years, and listened to answers that arrived cautiously. Some doors opened slowly. Others remained closed. He did not push for spectacle. He did not seek headlines. What he sought was acknowledgement, a quiet correction of silence rather than a public reversal of judgment. Not everything could be recovered, but enough remained to confirm what the old woman had always known. The truth had never been erased. It had simply been ignored. Weeks later, without announcement or ceremony, a small internal notice circulated. A name long absent was mentioned again, not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of judgment exercised under pressure. No apology was issued. None was requested. The change was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking for it. But it mattered. The officer returned to the bench one afternoon, unsure whether she would be there. She was. As always. He sat beside her once more, this time without hesitation. He told her what he had done, not as a victory, but as a continuation. She listened, then nodded slowly. Not in gratitude, not in relief, but in confirmation. The answer she had waited for was not found in documents or outcomes, but in action carried through without compromise. When they parted that day, there was no sense of finality. Just alignment. The officer walked away with a deeper understanding of his role, knowing that history did not demand perfection, only honesty. The old woman remained on the bench a little while longer, watching the city move as it always had. But for the first time in many years, she was no longer waiting. The past had been heard. The present had responded. And the future, quietly and without spectacle, had chosen to carry the story forward.